Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Nicholas Demoncho. I'm director of the Berkeley Center for New Media, and this is part of our Art and Technology and Culture lecture series, a series started more than 20 years ago by my colleague Ken Goldberg and also Greg Niemeyer, and that we are very delighted now forms an anchor role in an anchor piece of a much broader effort here on campus, the Arts and Design Mondays here at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. If you will join us next week, on the 13th of November, Bill Brown will also be speaking on the same theme of public reassembly that our speaker tonight, Michael Rock, will be speaking to. It is a real pleasure and distinct pleasure for me to introduce Michael Rock. I've known Michael since I was an undergraduate, and he was a young faculty member at the time at Yale University. And it was really interesting for me today to realize that, in fact, I never took a class with Michael, but I would probably count him as one of the more influential people in which I encountered in that entire undergraduate education. And the reason why, maybe the best way to introduce it is with an observation that the architectural historian Georges Teyssot made in discussing the early architecture of the architects of this building, Elizabeth Diller and Riccardo Scofidio, in which he noted at this point in the 1980s that the status of architecture and technology was already for the 100 or so years since the Industrial Revolution and increasing in the digital age, one of a simultaneous process of incorporation, that is of technology and media coming into the fabric of buildings, and one also of disembodiment, in which technology and media acted profoundly to dissolve the object status of buildings and to create new kinds of environments that were not legible as and discernible as building, landscape, and city in the traditional sense. As an undergraduate with a kind of latent interest in, latent instinct that this was of interest to me as a young designer, I sought out Michael, but that was a very easy thing to do because at the time and to this day, he was not only enormously intellectually generous, but incredibly generous also with things like his house and his incredibly beautiful lime green Saab 99. With which he toured New Haven. Michael's and my career intersected at a few other instrumental moments. When I was working with Diller Scofidio, myself as an architect, we worked together in the slightly misbegotten non-Four Seasons side of the Seagram's building on the renovations of the brasserie there. And then again at the American Academy in Rome when I had a somewhat junior fellowship there, and Michael had his Rome Prize. We toured such non-traditional Roman sites as the government cafeterias of the EUR together as well, with great design interest. So Michael's practice, even already when I first knew him, and increasingly in the last decades, operates at the forefront of thinking about the intersection of design and media, and increasingly architecture. For the past 2 decades, he's been collaborating with clients such as Rem Koolhaas's OMA and AMO, clients such as Prada, Kanye West, and many others from the non-profit to the very much for-profit. Michael's teaching has also increasingly operated more legibly at the intersection of architecture, media, and culture. He heads the Graphic Architecture Project at the Columbia Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, or GSAP, and then he also teaches related courses on architecture and narrative at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and remains affiliated also with Yale. I will only say also that his appearance here tonight is actually instrumentally related to the present difficulties of my job as director of the Berkeley Center for New Media. When I took over this job more than a year ago, in the summer of 2016, I was really interested and excited with the possibility to tackle and question the intersection of architecture, media, and culture that had interested me since my undergraduate days. And then, of course, was confronted by the prospect of first the Trump campaign, and then our current mediated moment in which social media is weaponized, in which data is a political commodity, and which the truth is ever more obscure. And so it was with a sense of delight and rediscovery that I saw popping up in my Instagram feed more than a year ago a remarkable series of 350-word essays by Michael, the so-called Instagram account Microcritique, I assume standing also for Michael Rock Critique, which many of us have been the beneficiaries of. And so saw in Michael someone who could speak not only to my very original interests, but also to the very particular moment at the intersection of politics, media, culture, and our collective future that we're facing today. So is with great pleasure and very much on our theme of public reassembly that I introduced Michael Rock. Thank you very much.
Thank you for fond memory of my Saab 99. I've forgotten about that. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I want to start with a kind of caveat, because despite all of Nicholas's kind words, I come before you in a somewhat naive state. And the quote here is famously from Roman Jakobson, as when he denied Vladimir Nabokov a position at Harvard to teach literature, that a novelist really wasn't qualified to teach literature. And I think in the same way, I would say that I'm an elephant, not a zoologist. I'm a designer first, and really the last 3 decades of my work have been designing things. And that design started really from studying graphic design, and then my practice changed until now I would say that my position is called creative director, which is a very contemporary kind of job, which no one really knows what it is exactly, but it's extremely important, I can guarantee you. And a creative director has this strange role of taking lots of different things and trying to make them work together, and that things should have some relationship to be understandable. And so what I thought I would do is take this problem of public reassembly and try to look at that through the way that a designer works and some of the issues I think that right now are relevant to us or that we struggle with. And the other thing a creative director does is they structure stories. And so the epigraph for this talk is Joan Didion's famous first line, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live," because the creative director creates these narratives out of pictures and words and using various different media, and assembles them in ways that make sense. And that could be through fashion, and that can be through a magazine, that can be through a corporate brand, other things. And so I see that very closely tying into this idea of public reassembly in terms of, at least the way that I think about it, in terms of creating this world out of pieces, and that it's that choice of pieces that makes it somehow understandable. And so I would say that this idea of public reassembly and the way I'm thinking about it is this way in which that we organize something coherent. And I would even argue that coherence may be the most basic premise of what a designer tries to achieve. And when I first started design, that was oftentimes meaning system or creating regularity or expected results. But I think now we think about it that coherence isn't the same as sameness. It's something else, and that what makes something coherent is that it all fits into some narrative in the way that the pieces work together. So they don't all have to be the same kind of pieces, but they need to make sense. So when I start to think about this idea of what are the stages of reassembly, I kind of use these 3 categories, which I base very loosely on Roberta Ungar from Harvard Law School in these 3 terms. So one, this idea of the formative context, that you would say somehow these established routines, things that happen as habit or tradition or anecdote, somehow evolve into something that is seemingly self-evident and institutionalized, and so a kind of coherence that seems to have no origin, but it's just real and is the way we live our life. And the result of that formative context is this idea of false necessity, that those coherences become entrenched, and Ungar talks about this idolatry of established institutions, that we start to believe them because they're so familiar to us and they seem real. But on the same time, there's a level of negative capability in the sense that those institutions are so tenuous, they're open for resistance and for recomposition. So the fact that they're fictions mean that they can be reorganized as well. And I would say that's what we talk about when we talk about reassembly, that we look at the world the way it is and we break it up and put it back together in new ways, and that's the way that we make our worlds as designers. So the other thing that I want to say too is that because I'm coming from a specific position about creative director, I want to talk about this idea of branding. And I know that sometimes that's an incredibly distasteful term in cultural organizations and in academic organizations, but like it or not, branding's become one of the major organizing principles of the world as we know it right now. States have brands, and corporations have brands, and people have brands, and institutions have brands, and everyone's talking about that. And when they talk about brand, they may be all talking about different things, but I think it's a way to think about this idea of assembly. But maybe first we should listen to an expert.
Makes branding so special and so important. And there are a lot of things. And it started with me very early on just by having success. You know, when you're successful, that sort of creates a little bit of a brand.
Okay. So success creates brand. Well, maybe that's too simplified a way of thinking about it. But I would say maybe that what brand is that it's this act of assemblage where that by putting pieces together, by pulling these things together and putting them together, that we create those seemingly coherent entities. Maybe success is the result of that in the sense that it feels real, but I think really it's about the act of this assembling. And so what follows now is 10 brief thoughts on assembling a coherent world, the way we think about design. So number one, unnaturalism. Let's start here. This is probably the last point where we're free of branding, because somehow we got to here. And so we have to take the assumption that everything basically that's not the savannah is designed in some ways. And that because it's designed, it has intention, it has points of view, it has attitude, it's made as a political position, it has an ideology. Mark Wigley and Beatriz Colomina talked about in their most recent Biennale in Turkey that the planet's been completely encrusted by design. This idea, it's almost a geological layer of design now. And really that's the layer that we're dealing with. We're not dealing with the natural, we're dealing with the designed world, because that's the world of intention. And as we know, we don't really have nature per se anymore. And the things that we think of as natural are created and created with intentions by designers. And even things like open space, real nature exists because we allow it to exist, and there's an edge to it. And even something as minute as our own chemistry and biology is subject to design. So if we basically assume that we're dealing with a world where everything is designed, then we have to talk about the nature of why it's designed the way it is and what kind of world it creates because it's designed that way. So let's take some very simple examples. And I apologize because I'm an elephant that some of these examples might seem extremely simplistic to you, but it's a starting point. So if we take this idea of formative context, we have a way of dividing the world, a system And as designers, we have a choice when we design something. We either accept the way that it's done or we decide to rearrange it. So if I ask a bunch of graphic designers to design a clock, what you get is this. Because basically the organizational principle underneath it, that we've divided the world into a series of minutes and seconds and they have certain value, is taken at face value. That's the formative context that exists. And therefore, the designer works at the level of only reiterating and reimposing that system over and over again. And in fact, the more we design on it, the more real it becomes, the more entrenched it becomes, the more unchangeable it becomes, because we're building up that geological layer of design with more and more things. So when you see this, you have this disruption of the context, because we say, okay, well, there's no reason why this isn't just as good a way to divide time as anything else. And so the question is, for a designer always is, are you either embellishing the existing system or are you creating a new system? And at what point do you accept your problem for design? And you can look at that in lots of different contexts. So, for instance, anything that has experience to it, something like color, we can come up with all different ways of structuring on top of that, creating divisions and separations and categories, because that's what designers do. They create categories. And those categories are the way that we understand the world. And the categories are given life by things like design. And those can be somewhat neutral, like the way that we might divide our perception of color, or they can be extremely political, where those categories are made scientific or seemingly real, and the graphic design in this case gives a kind of inevitability that these are categories that we can structure our world around. And we have lots of different ways of doing that, and there's usually a kind of attendant graphic system that helps that and gives life to that level of categorization. So if we look at a very current condition, which I think everybody here has probably dealt with in some ways and seen many different results to it. It's often thought about as a signage problem. I would say it's really an architecture problem. Because this idea of the bimorphic room is really an idea which is established as an architectural idea, and then it's developed by things like the ADA code and the Uniform Building Code that determines certain kinds of architectural results that need to happen to address certain kinds of social conditions. But it's important to remember that it wasn't so long ago in big parts of the United States that there weren't 2 doors, there were 3 doors. And the colored door was neither male nor female, it was a different category altogether. And so the fact that there's 3 doors, or the fact that there's 2 doors, gives a kind of explicit life to the category. It's real because we've designed it to be real. And it's not until that you actually overturn the design problem that you can start to see the manufactured nature of or structure being underneath it. And you can think about that in lots of different ways. That when you design something like a form that has categories and you're confronted that there's a box that you have to fill in, the form itself gives a life to or an inevitability to the category that it's representing. And Harari talks about this idea that identity is always problematic because it's based on a fictional story that sooner or later collides with reality, or I would say sooner or later collides with another fictional story, the one that replaces it. So at some point, we live happily with our stories until the point that they don't function anymore, and in which case we have to replace it with something else. But the problem is that the systems that we use and the way that we think about organization are so familiar to us and are so deeply ingrained in the way that we think about the world that it's very difficult for us to think outside of them. So we might all be familiar with one way of organizing animals, but Foucault's famous vocation of Borges' classification of animals from supposedly ancient Chinese encyclopedia said it's also a perfectly valid way to organize something, but it's very difficult for us to think in that way, to imagine the mind that would use this as one of the organizational systems. And there's lots of examples of that, right?
Known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know.
So we have to confront these kind of organizations all the time and decide, do we embrace them or do we overturn them? And Foucault talks about that idea of the stark impossibility of thinking that, how difficult it is for us to think outside of the systems that are so embedded in us, and how, I would say, as designers, we're so complicit in the extension of those systems as the stories we live by. So, chapter 2, I want to look at two graphic artifacts. Here, a map that's drawn by the colonial government in 1706 of the town of map of Charleston, and drawn with very specific intention to understand the fortification of the city and the property that's owned within it. And it represents a certain place on the surface of Earth, and it becomes a graphic representation of that place. At the same time, at almost the same year, there's a map that was drawn through interviews with Native American chiefs of the same spot of land. The area on the upper left is the city of Charleston, that represents this soft interrelationship between areas or territories that were controlled by different tribes. So they're both pictures of the same thing, in the sense they're both pictures of the same point on Earth. And we can ask ourselves which one is true, and of course that's impossible to answer. But we can determine certain things about the mind that makes those kind of representations and the kind of coherent world that they imagine. So one is obsessed with interiority, with protection, with the enclosure, with property which is highly delineated, and basically everything outside of that is blank. The other's obsessed with interrelationships, of connections, of soft boundaries, and of juxtaposition. It's two different worlds that are depicted, and that the form itself, the map itself, becomes a way of bringing that world into being. And Nelson Goodman talks about this idea of something not found in the world, but built into a world, that the graphic element is the thing that constructs the world itself, that we understand the world through the thing that we make about it. So, chapter 3, Mark Wigley, my old boss at Columbia, spoke at an event I had one time, and he asked this question, which is, if you know Mark, it's a very typical Mark question: is the Atlantic Ocean graphic design? And of course, no, but maybe. So, you think about that. Well, what's in this name, and what does it mean, and how do we understand it as something? And so, if you think about the kind of unknown space that can't be defined, so there can't be a name to that because it has no edge. And part of the notion of naming something is that you create an edge around it. And if you look at those early maps that attempt to chart that area from the European point of view, it basically has no western boundary. It's it's a thing which is defined on the east but empty on the west. So there can't be a thing because it has no perimeter to it. And when you start to see then these first maps where the North American continent starts to be defined, here is just almost a sliver as a kind of edge. Now you start to have an entity, and once you have that entity, you can name that. And that then becomes a thing which has its own shape, its own qualities. You could be measured, it can be fought over, it can be shared, it can be exploited for various political and economic gain. And so it's by naming it and then by drawing it, the thing itself starts to have value to it. And then we can continue on with all of these elaborations of the thing itself that become more and more technical and more defined. But the thing itself still remains this vague category. And so as the designer, we accept the category and we continue to measure it and to draw it. And in each one of those things, it becomes more real. Until finally we can see that as a kind of entity that we can pick out on any map. We can always identify, even though its shape is really something which is entirely made through a series of designs. And it's not until that you have the map that you can actually start to question it. And so that idea that all maps are somewhat military because they always claim territory. So by drawing it, for the graphic act of drawing it, it creates something which now has value, which could be disputed. So let's take a really stupid example. So we have a piece of land and in North America, and at a certain point, 4 straight lines are drawn on top of that land. That act, that jurisdictional act of creating a kind of division of the space, now allows designers to start to make a whole series of stuff. And that stuff basically evokes and brings the thing into reality. So we can design a border, and we can design a seal, and we can have a flag, and we can have a slogan. And that can have certain kinds of identities, and we can have an architecture that goes along with it and speaks about its qualities. And we can talk about certain kinds of characters of its residents, and we can analyze them and figure out what they're like. And they have leaders and strange customs and activities. And that buildup of all from that essentially illogical act in the beginning of the creation of this coherence, simply by drawing 4 lines, allows the designer to elaborate on that story all the time. And so the bringing together of the story of this seemingly empty space is really an act of creative direction. And then we can start to analyze it and say, okay, that's not really so Wyoming. You know, that doesn't seem to fit. It's off-brand. And off-brand is one of the charges of a creative director, is decide what's off-brand, meaning it doesn't seem to fit into the story. Because the story is this thing which is built up over a long period of time with lots of different pieces, and it's made out of all of these different fragments. And Goodman talks about this idea of the creation of plausible self-evidence. Like, of course it exists. I just drove across the border. Of course it exists. I have the sweatshirt. Of course it exists. I've seen the movie. All of those things give it a kind of function. And the function of the creative director is to make sure it all stays coherent. So what are the tactics then of creative direction and of coherence? The first one is the most basic one of all design, which is that things that look the same are the same. And everyone's familiar with how that works, right? Which is that if one of the dresses is red, it's off-brand. You have, everything works because it's all knee length. Everything works because it's satin. Everything works because, there's a kind of coherence to just bringing everything together. And we immediately see that that's whole. And, that has lots of different implications, because where things are coherent because they're uniform, the individual disappears and the system basically takes control. And I would say this is the early way we would think about designing coherent systems, was make everything red, put everything in the corner. That gives a kind of easy system that you understand how it fits. And in some ways, that idea of creating the uniform system erases the individuality and allows you to see the system above and beyond the position of the individual. It also creates those kind of categories, right? Which is that we create a system, the girls are pink, the boys are blue, you fit into one or the other, and it's that simple uniformity that makes it self-evident. You got to put on one leotard or the other, you don't have a choice. and you have to make that choice, you're basically confronted with the decision of how you fit into the categorical system. And that has lots of different kinds of functions that we're really familiar with. And it also allows you to align with others simply by joining in the system of uniformity. You can, by putting on a t-shirt, you become part of the system. And you can make divisions between things too, between simple juxtaposition, you know when one thing is one thing and one thing's the other. And that's extremely useful as a designer and something you use all the time in the sense of creating systems of difference so that you see things as unique and understandable in pieces. And again, it's a very simple way to kind of align yourself with political positions. Anyone can join in. All you have to do is look the same. And I think we're quite familiar with that recently in the sense that these homegrown branding systems where it's not about it being exactly the same, but being close is enough, where you can join by being part of the system, but you don't need to be exactly an authorized version of it. You can just simply juxtapose in with the rest. So, of course, there's also issues where things don't fit in the system and where the system privileges one thing and not the other. And we've seen where that's gone horribly wrong because that idea of creating uniformity can be extended in ways which are incredibly sinister and where certain kinds of normative ways of being, whether you're in the system or outside the system, can be used for different kinds of political and ideological power. So just being like everything else can be a powerful way of belonging, but also a powerful way of excluding as well. But that aspect of the system being based on difference is so core to the way a designer thinks. And it becomes really one of the essential tools. So let's look at that in maybe the simplest element of a graphic designer's language, which is the language of typography. Which is the way typography works is that, first of all, we expect that all letters will be more or less alike. And that has a history, which is that letters were originally made by a certain kind of tool. The tool had a certain kind of mark that it made, and so there was a unity, a coherence to the look of certain kind of letter forms. So just the fact that the letter was carved by a certain kind of chisel gave it a certain shape to it. But what we realized with the development of typography was that differences in letters allows you to create differences in meaning. And it's the attachment of these different samenesses and differences that creates the whole art of typography. So the development of what we call a font now is the creation of things which look the same and things which look different. And when you look at pages, basically it's using different kinds of typography to make different kinds of meaning on the text itself. So you're familiar with the fact that heads and body copy and footnotes all look different, and that signifies a kind of organized, coherent system of reading. And so all of typography can be based on the fact that letter forms that look different mean different things, and you have to assign those differences to different meanings. So if you think about a text basically as something which is completely raw and undifferentiated, it's the typographer's job to transform that into something which has a coherent meaning by attaching certain kinds of typographic differences to the differences in the text itself. And so it becomes coherent or understandable to us because the designer adds increasingly more and more complex kinds of typographic changes to signify for the reader of how they should read the text. So typography is a kind of storytelling on top of a text because the original text is given meaning through the designer's act of applying typography. Now that happens at the level of a single paragraph or a single sentence, but it also happens at the level of a kind of institutional group of typography too, that we recognize certain kinds of properties or publications because of the way that their typography works. We expect that the New York Times is always more or less going to look like that. It can change around a little bit, there can be some variation, but it's not going to change wildly from one day to the next, because part of the coherence of the New York Times is that its typography stays stable and that it uses the same systems over and over again to make its points. Or if you look at a book where you'd expect that there might be some transformation in the book from part to part, but it's basically following the same system throughout. You establish a set of rules, and those rules then transform over a period of time. And those have economic aspects too as well. So in the course of publication, you have basically two aspects of the publication. You have editorial and you have advertising, and we know those are different because they look different and they're handled differently. So the interior pages of the magazine look one way. They're coherently part of the editorial position of the magazine, and that's allowed because the things on the outside of that can be anything you want. You can have any kind of advertising that you want. So you have, in one sense, something stable and unchanging, and on the other side, this thing which is constantly up for grabs and can be negotiated in many different ways. And we can think about that in terms of things like websites where even the spatial difference is really immaterial. The difference jumping from the New York Times to the Guardian is one click on your computer, but we know that we've made that transition because we've applied these typographic or design differences to them. So we see the world differently through that lens of graphic design to see them. So when we think about that then, the aspect of applying graphic difference to create content difference, we have to talk about the problem of style. And style is oftentimes, I think, underappreciated in terms of its effect in terms of creating coherence and the idea, the way we assemble those words. But it's something that's really essential to the way that we know what's what.
One of these things is not like the other. One of these things doesn't belong. Can you tell which thing is not like the other before I finish my song?
So it's a kind of a really basic lesson, but an important one too, in the sense that it's assigning these differences, these visual or graphic differences, to other kinds of meaning that allow us to negotiate the world. So we have to learn, luckily we have someone to teach us, that these differences are meaningful somehow, and we have to understand at what level they're different and how they're assigned. And so then we can talk about style in the sense that we can see all of these pieces somehow fit together because they were designed to, because they share certain kinds of qualities or visualizations that we can make meaningful. And then we can say that these two things, even though they fulfill the exact same function, are different somehow because we've assigned different kinds of stylistic ways of designing them and understanding them. So they create two different stories here. The story's not different because the function is different. The story's different because how we overwrite the function with design, with either graphic design or other kinds of design. And that overwriting can take all different kinds of qualities. So I may feel very uncomfortable using the razor on the right, on your left, sorry. Not because it doesn't do the exact same function, but somehow we've assigned certain kinds of qualities to it as designers. And that's a story. So that's a story which is embedded into the plastic of that razor. And that story now can have a meaning that creates a whole world around it. One's a daisy and one's a kind of hot rod, and they're used for totally different functions, even though they're used for exactly the same function. So the function doesn't change, but the story changes, and the way that we write the story is part of the idea of the creative direction. And that story has lots of different components to it. So if I'm a creative director at Porsche, I have to make sure that the car on your left is different enough from the one on the right, but not so different that you don't see it as a continuation of something before. So part of the idea of creating the coherence of the brand of Porsche is that there's certain parameters that I have to stay within as a designer. I have to understand that there's a certain design language, and that the evolution of design language can only go so far because at some point it'll be, again, off-brand and it'll no longer be seen as part of it. So the design is constrained by its own history in that case, in the sense that we tell the story about the design of the car, but that's designed within this, the history of the brand itself. And that's a constraint. Or if we look at here a series of dresses designed by Miuccia Prada over the course of 30 years, we say that even though they change radically with the time and with the idea of fashion, they all stay within a certain kind of design language. That coherent design language, which makes it her work in that case, can only go so far, and at a certain point, if it goes too far, it'll no longer be her work anymore, it'll be something else. And so we have to, as the creative director, look at what fits into the system and what falls out. And we can look at that in terms of this as well. Here, the design for Ridley Scott's Blade Runner in 1984, and then the most recent one from this year, Blade Runner 2049. There's two worlds, both created as a kind of imagination of the future, but one farther in the future than the other. And so when designing the new one below, it has to be within the context of the thing above. It has to see as an evolution from that, and not something which has totally replaced it. And so what the kind of revolution that Scott did in the first Blade Runner was this idea of the building scale image, where you have this the facade of the building that becomes the image. In the new one, those have become holograms. They've come off the building, and they directly address the user. But that's the next step you would have in the 30-year development of the city that they're imagining. So the coherence has to be within the logic of the design. And let's look at one more example. So here, a series of covers from Penguin of different novels. And again, they're not all identical exactly, but they're somehow enough identical that we see that it all works within a system, and that we can see that as a universe that's been designed in a certain way, and therefore Wuthering Heights and Lolita can exist both in those in that system, have a little bit of identity for themselves, but mostly the corporate identity of the publishing house itself. That's what gives it coherence, the fact that it all comes from the same location. So of course, if we look at style, we have lots of problems in terms of what it means exactly. What do we mean when we talk about style? If we use Google search as a tool for testing that, we can search Madonna and Child. So the subject is the same, but of course we have many different styles about the way that story is told. And so we'd say that it's all the same story, more or less, but the expression of it would tell us wildly different kinds of stories about the culture that imagined that story. And so it's not really about content in this case, but it's something else. It's about the way the story is told and what the manner of telling the story is, and how does that make us understand the culture that created it. If I put into Google search Russian constructivism, I get a whole bunch of things which look more or less the same, but they're wildly different. And so they stylistically, in terms of certain things like color and shape, have a coherence, but they range from everything like early posters for the battleship Potemkin to arm yourself with a slouchy bag, which with wildly different content. So in terms of the differences we think about in terms of design, we can think about those differences as formal differences that can be applied, but the form itself has a certain kind of meaning as well. If I put into the Google search Experimental Jet Set, who's a graphic design group from Holland, who famously use only one typeface for all of their work, I see something which is quite uniform in terms of its visualization. So now there's a quite uniform, say, corporate identity, even though that all of this work is for wildly different clients and for wildly different subjects. So the system of design itself is something which unifies all the work. So it's not about content, and it's not about form, but it's about the structure of the designer themselves that put a kind of layer on top of that. And if I do one more, and I say Stefan Sagmeister, one of our colleagues, and who's a designer who oftentimes uses this kind of bodily metaphor, again, you see a kind of coherence based in the design, the point of view of the design, a way of making typography, a way of using the body, even though the subjects could be wildly different. So we tried to perceive these different patterns and understand them and understand sort of how to apply those levels of stylistic difference to create unities within the things that we're designing. And that's the way you think about now creating something like a corporate brand, which is at what level are things the same and what levels do we allow them to be different. And Goodman talks about that it's very difficult once that you structure the search in a certain kind of way to understand anything that doesn't fit into that structure, because we are aligned already to understand how we organize the world. That leads us to certain kinds of searches and certain kinds of organizations. So, Chapter 8, let's talk now specifically about brand and how that works and how that uses those kind of samenesses and differences. So this is the very familiar way that all of us know brand, which is that we recognize them because we recognize the way they look and that certain things are alike about them. And this is the context that exists in, which is that there's this world of stuff to get, and we need to understand that stuff is somehow different from the other stuff. And therefore, as a designer, we need to go and make those differences visual. So really, brands are about creating difference within that extremely crowded marketplace of things, and using those things like stylistic and typographic differences to create meaningful differences between products. But this is the problem with that, which is that we like to think of that as designers, we're making things which are real. We're representing things as they are. But if you look at products, basically there's about 7 companies in the world that make almost everything. So all of that stuff is actually the product of individual sort of mega corporations that are producing it. So all that difference that happens on the outer edge is a kind of manufactured difference to hide the unified corporate ownership of all the pieces. So while Procter & Gamble makes all of these things, they all appear to be these kind of different things. So the idea that they're independent identities is really a manufactured story that's written on top of the object itself. So the corporate ownership and the idea of the backstory is hidden by the difference at the level of expression. And so when you have two things which are more or less the same thing, they're both made by the same company, they both do exactly the same thing, but you create autonomous identities around them because there's different language and different ways of representing. And so the world gets divided into a series of things, but those things are really independent stories which are created and, again, overwritten onto the form. And if you're familiar with shopping at Trader Joe's, you realize that this is a kind of typical strategy where, kind of everything there is really the product of one company, but you get the feeling that you're shopping for stuff that's different because it looks different. So you kind of add in that level of difference through this skin of corporate identity or graphic identity, and a series of seemingly different products that are really the product of the same company at the heart of it. So there's this kind of interesting story that happened. There's a huge mega corporation called Beatriz, and Beatriz makes lots of things like dog food and Quaker oats and peanut butter and things like that. And at some point in the 70s, it decided that it was really bad that people didn't realize how many things they made. So at the end of their commercials, they started to add this little thing, which is like, oops, sorry. So it's this really spooky kind of thing that came on at the end, and all of a sudden at the end of all these commercials, it's like, "We're Beatriz" would come on, and it was this horrible failure because no one wants to think that your dog food and your peanut butter come from the same company. You want to make sure that there's this difference between them, and so this attempt to sort of reveal the corporate ownership was actually contrary to the fictional nature of the things that you're making in the world. So when you're making all of these these things, you're always in this relationship or matrix relationship between all the other things. And so a corporate identity is always placed in some kind of differential relationship with all the other things that it could be and it should be different from. And so I can guarantee you almost any company you go into right now has some version of this where they're placing themselves in the center and they have this constellation of stuff around them, all the things that they're not. Because it's an attempt to try to define the autonomous identity of the brand, that it should be its own thing. And in that way, it should be a kind of living organization that has an independent identity. So thinking about the corporation as a biological form is something, kind of, whoops, where's Mitt?
Corporations are people, my friend.
So the notion of the corporation as the person is there, who's making a totally different point, but the thing is that to see the corporation as a biology that has a personality, that does certain things, starts to become, for the creative director, an important tool, because you start to say that rather than being a corporation being like a machine, a corporation is like a person that has kind of quirks. They're usually this way, but sometimes they do something really unexpected, or they tend to be mature, but sometimes they're not. So that aspect of assigning a corporation a kind of human quality that gives it differentiation. So.
Hello, I'm a Mac. Hello, I'm a PC.
So, this way that you could say, if corporate identity was about the creation of a regularized system where all the parts fit into place and it works as a kind of well-oiled machine, the brand is the idea of the corporation as the human, which has all of these unexpected qualities. It more or less stays consistent, the way we expect our friends to stay more or less consistent, but occasionally it can surprise you, and so you assign these different qualities. Now, the problem with spending billions of dollars to create these autonomous identities is that at some point something like this happens, where these things which we once thought were highly differentiated suddenly become the same thing. So United and Continental used to be fierce competitors, and at one point suddenly they were just unified into one thing. So we have to now imagine that all of those qualities that they had become merged together, and that differentiation disappears and it becomes a new object. And there's lots of examples of that. So for instance, with the fashion design Vêtements, where basically the designer uses the brands of other organizations and sucks those into their own identity. So Champion becomes a kind of form to speak the Vêtements story. Or, kind of these really inexplicable ones too, which is that, who knows what that is exactly, but some kind of weird hybrid. But Ungar talks about this idolatry of the established institution, that we expect the thing to maintain its wholeness and its quality, and the creative director's job is to make sure that it stays within these quote-unquote guardrails. Now we can extract that idea and actually write it larger from the corporation to the state, because we've seen it happen in our lifetime, right, where Europe went from this mosaic of countries to becoming this new unified form that we have to sort of now see as something coherent. So what was maybe on the right a semi-coherent relationship of individual states now becomes a kind of unified one that can then start to have its own kind of iconography and imagery that allows us to read it as unified. And so even things like something like currency is an important one, where the currency gives a kind of unity to the place because it all looks the same, it all has the same quality, it can pass between those different places. And looking at OMA's famous alternative flag of Europe, to take all of the possible member states and to extrude those, and that the flag then becomes a kind of barcode which constantly can have more stripes or less stripes, and that becomes the unifying element, which now we have a new entity, Europe, which is made out of all of these fragments of old entities. And Benedict Anderson in Imagined Communities talks about that idea of this unself-conscious coherence, that we don't think about it as being manufactured, even though we've seen it manufactured in our own lifetime. It somehow loses that manufactured quality and starts to become a real entity that we see as unified. And of course, we also see in our own lifetime that what happens in forward could also go in reverse, and that shape that we started to think about as Europe now becomes something else because we lose part of it. So the notion of the coherent state, which is represented through things like coherent shape and currency and flags, is actually this very fragile form, and the form which can be rewritten or redrawn at all times and needing to be redesigned. So the last couple chapters then deal more with these very specific things. And the first is this idea of the sign itself, because if you think about typography on one hand being the most basic unit of something like graphic design, the sign is maybe the most basic unit of spatial coherence. And we think about the kind of edges of things, and the edges of things are often talked about through very weak elements like this. In the midst of this vast landscape, this one sign could have a kind of identifying power, and that creates an edge between something which is public and something that's private, or something which comes to an end, or stops, or doesn't allow you to enter, or where it's there's a certain kind of danger. So the sign is seemingly such a simple form, and maybe this is the most basic one. You're here, and you are. But that aspect of the sign reassuring you that you're someplace, and that it creates a sense of edge and order to the world that you're in. And I was mentioning this morning about, at Yale, the university is covered with these blue square signs that reassure you that you're safe, right? As long as you're near one of those, you're basically inside the confines of the university. As soon as you stop seeing them, it's a free-for-all, you're outside of it. So the sign basically creates a world that you exist in. It creates this unconscious edge that the area is under surveillance, it's controlled, it has certain kinds of values to it, and it's the simple repetition of that sign that allows you to exist in the coherent world. And at the same time, there's a kind of network of these blue lights which indicate these safety telephones. And again, they sort of state what the edge is. What's the edge between the uncontrolled and the controlled, between the safe and the dangerous, between the incoherent and the coherent. Those are all done with these very weak elements that you can stick in the ground and have this incredibly powerful effect. And they can also indicate this aspect of where you are and that the place is meaningful. And this is this amazing program that Kodak did in the 60s, where they basically branded different views around the United States, saying like, this is where you should take your picture. And that said, okay, this is a place which is valuable, and this is something that has certain kind of quality, and it's purely by placing the sign into the landscape that you have that organizational principle. Now, I'm sure many of you have been in the situation where late at night you're sitting at an intersection absolutely alone on the road and waiting for a red light to change. And that aspect that the power the sign has, the power to make you do certain kinds of things, that you wait in a totally illogical way at an empty intersection for 2 minutes for the light to change, because the light represents a whole network of power behind it. So the administration that exists underneath the light makes us obey it in a certain way. And so the sign basically as an organizing principle for the landscape becomes a way to change our direction, to change the flow of people through the landscape, and to tell us that we're basically within or outside of the system. So if you think about something like the interstate, as long as you're under these green signs, you're under the jurisdiction of the federal government, that you're safe on the highway, but you're also under obligation to its rules, and that the coherence of the highway is just simply created by the repetition of these graphic elements that happen over and over again. Or the way that simple things like painting the ground or telling you to do certain kinds of things changes your movement through space and can direct you to go certain places. And this aspect of using the graphic to control the landscape and to create certain kinds of paths and directions becomes actually an important part of the way that a lot of organizations and companies are starting to think about the way that they tell their stories as well. Because if you can control the people's path, then you can control basically how the order and the narrative they understand things in. So you can start to understand where they go and the spaces they occupy. And then you can start to do what's called this kind of visitor journey mapping, where each point along that path can be designed in a way. Once you've controlled the path, then you can control the experience along that path. And that starts to create a unified narrative for the organization. So this is something, for instance, museums are really obsessed with at the moment, where to think about everything from the point that you leave your house in the morning till the point that you go back to bed, your whole journey has been designed in a certain way. And it's designed because you know what the trajectory is. And that would then deal with all different kinds of spaces and how you would experience those spaces and what you would use them for. But signs, of course, define other kinds of edges as well, and have other kinds of confrontations too. And the fact that oftentimes the differences we talk about in terms of the social differences have very simple kinds of directional differences as well. The sign serves as a political act that makes kinds of political distinctions between people and who's allowed and who isn't. So this is a very interesting notion of public, where the distinction or the edge is something which is purely a system of power which is hidden behind the language of the sign itself. So the final chapter really is about, if the sign is about creating the edge, and the brand is about creating the edge, and the map is about creating the edge, perhaps the biggest, the most explicit way of creating edge is the wall itself. And so we'll go back to our expert here.
Build that wall, build that wall, build that wall, build that wall.
So why is there such an obsession about building the wall? If the edge is a kind of jurisdictional element that creates coherence, the wall is maybe the most brutal expression of that. Any wall. And of course we have long histories of walls creating distinctions between things, about insides and outsides and edges of things. And what the wall allows us to do onto the landscape is to say everything within it is one thing and everything outside it is the other. So as a graphic element, the wall is maybe the most explicit element that allows us to see a kind of coherent world that has limits to it, that only expands to a certain edge. And so we only have to have coherence within the perimeter of the wall, and everything outside that can be, again, wild. And so we see the landscape as a series of these impressions or overwriting of graphic form onto it, where the natural is cut by the designed, and the design has its own logic or coherence within it. Now, if you look at maybe one of the great examples of jurisdictional element, up till about 2 months before this wall was built, everyone denied there would be a wall. There was anyone who talked about it said there would be no wall, but the wall obviously represented a whole series of political and jurisdictional elements which suddenly became apparent in the city. And so in Berlin, basically, the city went from a single city to a divided city with this element, this design element, which suddenly said the coherence of the city now is divided, and now we have two cities. And the wall itself becomes symbolic, but also obviously functional, but a symbolic element which says the coherence that once existed no longer exists. We have this graphic way of dividing.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
So what goes up can come down, and then we have basically a kind of reunification. And so the single coherence becomes a double one and then becomes single again. And so the idea that anything is fixed is belied by the fact that these elements change in such a seemingly random pattern. But we see that other walls happen all the time, and again, oftentimes in a backdrop of denial, that the wall in Palestine was denied that it would happen, and then it happened. And this idea that the wall is a kind of conspiratorial element which appears at some point and with seemingly no precedent, but there's no caption to the wall, it just exists, and so it creates a new coherence without a kind of author. It's important to remember that walls come and go. If we look at Rome, Rome had a very important wall which then at a certain point became illogical, and it was overtaken by another kind of coherence. Or walls which are almost invisible, if you look at the idea of the eruv, which is a kind of wire which extends for the Orthodox community, a kind of inside space that allows you to carry things on the Sabbath. So the wire is basically extended from the house, and everything inside the wire is then now considered inside. So throughout New York, there's huge areas which are surrounded by these wires, a kind of invisible wall, which is only meaningful to certain kinds of communities. So the wall extends and creates a coherence within it, but the coherence has to be read only through certain kinds of communities. And then there's the borders which have weak or almost invisible elements as well. So here we have the division between two jurisdictional units, between the United States and Canada. And so you have this kind of defined edge which has a symbolic division between them. But if you look at the division between Belgium and Netherlands, for instance, it's as simple as some paint sprayed on the road, or it runs right through your restaurant. As a kind of, an edge, but a certainly very weak one. Or the between Sweden and Norway. Again, these edges which are soft edges rather than hard ones. Or here, the famed Mexican-United States border, which actually runs through the middle of a totally different jurisdictional unit, which is a reservation, which has its claims as its own territory areas both above and below the border. So which border is real? Or then these kind of very temporary things too, which become borders only for a certain amount of time, or a kind of weak border which comes and goes only as necessary. So this idea of this kind of imaginary cartography which is written onto the landscape, a graphic element, that gives for a short period of time a certain kind of coherence, allows us to understand the world in a certain way, but which may come or go without logic. But also those kinds of cartographies have this ideological component to it, which is always writing out an ideology onto the landscape itself. So, in conclusion, if we look at this idea of the coherent system somehow is shared, let's say even the brand system is shared because we share this belief that we agree on something, and the design elements somehow fit into that. So that belief is somehow reinforced by physical evidence. We believe it's true because we can see it's true. And so as designers, basically our job is to provide that evidence. And as again, I think as a designer, you have two positions when you start anything. Either you reinforce the system or you overturn it. So if we take now a very, very simple example, on top of this vast sky, we write a series of stories on top of that. It's not inherent in the thing, it's built into the world because of the way that we tell that story and we project onto it. And so those stories are projected onto our universe. But then it's from that very basic beginning, it's the elaboration of those stories over and over and over again that start to give them real power. Thank you.
To start us off. I don't know, Michael, if you're familiar with the book, the science fiction book by China Mieville called The City in the City? Oh, called The City in the City. The City in the City describes two cities which actually exist within the same wall, whose inhabitants either, it's sort of loosely said in Eastern Europe, the inhabitants of the two cities wear different clothing and are prohibited by law from recognizing or interacting with each other, and they intersect only in a central architectural space of the city hall of both cities, which is coterminous. So in our current culture, we inhabit at least two universes of media and branding, the world of Fox News, of Fox and Friends, and Glenn Beck and all the rest, and the world of the overlapping world of Trumpland, and then the world of quote unquote more thoughtful media and the radical left wing and all the rest. So given that you started with brands and ended with walls, what do you have any reflections on how two brands coexist within the same boundary, and what we can do to create an architecture of intersection between them?
Well, I mean, it's a question, do they coexist in the same boundary, or how long they can, or something like that?
Yeah.
Like, is the situation tenable? You know, we started the conversation this afternoon about this idea of multiple screen and
Yeah.
multitasking, and whether you really see two things at once, or you're really flipping back and forth between the two. And I think it's a kind of similar situation where, you know, do we really exist in two worlds simultaneously, or are we just getting adept at flip-flopping? I think that you have to believe that somehow that the narrative has to change. It has to have a counter narrative somehow that's compelling enough to get people behind it. And you have to believe that political movements are based on people following ideas, and that they would get involved in the story and want to be part of that. And I think that maybe the two stories are too weak right now, and so they're kind of in a neutralized position, so you have neither dominant somehow. But you know, I think that there's a possibility that one rises up, and that could be for the worse, depending on what side you're on. And so, and we've seen lots of examples historically where some very disastrous stories have become predominant, right, and for a long period of time. So I don't have an answer right now, but I'm actively terrified along with everybody else.
All right, do we have questions from the audience? Maybe we can get the lights up a little bit, just so folks can see. And do please wait for the microphone, because that helps our audience online.
This right here.
Thank you. There's a translator of Chinese documents that calls all this world pretty much the bullshit factory. It's kind of a form of epistemology, of kind of a speculative epistemology. You shall believe this way. We are going to basically simplify the world so it's much easier to deal with, and all of the kinds of pleasures and treasures and bad things that happen in a village in Mexico and on an island off Thailand. I mean, something that is basically this mass consumerism, mass culture thing. How do you react to that kind of, I guess, sense that, you know, you're creating structures of belief, and kind of not more diverse structures, but less diverse structures, things that are cognitively and experientially more homogenized within the system of a dominant culture.
I understand the question, and I want to divide my culpability into two parts. One sense, the culpability of being a designer working in the world today, which I think we all share that culpability, and then a personal one in terms of my own work, because I think that the way I deal with it in my own work is to try actually to add complexity rather than to remove it, and that I think that there's places where design can insert confusion or depth or embellishment or other things that actually bring things like delight or question or uncertainty into that exact situation, which is a thin, reduced, shallow kind of relationship, a differential relationship. On the other hand, while that's maybe a way that I kind of justify the way I do my own work, I think on a bigger sense, we work within this economy at the moment, and the economy is being driven by a whole series of factors. And all of us, I would say everyone here, is culpable in that one, which is that it's, I think, a direct result of the way that information is transmitted, which is transmitted through devices that allow very simple ideas to be sent out to many people at once, and the more simple the idea, the more effective it is. And there's almost, if the argument is between simplicity and complexity, or between reduction and embellishment, simplicity almost always wins. And I think that Trump's tweeting is exactly the model of that, which is that it's reduced down to this incredibly powerful technique because it lacks nuance, because it lacks subtlety, all those things like that. And I'm not sure that nuance and subtlety actually are the effective resistance to the simplicity. So I think that the problem for all of us right now is to figure out how within the structure that is created, how can we go and counteract some of those forms which we see as disastrous with another kind of language, another kind of generosity, or another way of adding something to the world. This design is not about purely reduction, but it's about actually adding something, or adding complexity, or adding narrative to it. So I think that my way of thinking about it is that it is about creating narrative, and it's about creative narratives which can be consumed and can be distributed, but aren't about simplicity and reduction, but actually about something which is more valuable, I guess. But exactly how, I'm not sure.
Thank you for the lecture. How do you approach brand with your firm 2x4? Looking retroactively at your work, how would you think about that brand now?
The brand of 2x4? Yes. It's an interesting exercise to try to do that. And I think that there's this, and it ties a little bit into your question also, which is this aspect where as people have control over their own media, they become very cognizant of the image they're projecting, right? So let's take Instagram as an example, where people now think about who they're representing themselves, how they're representing themselves through their feed, and they're saying, I shouldn't post this picture because it doesn't go along with what I do, or I should put this kind of filter on it because all my things are blurry, or whatever it is. But you're creating this kind of idealized vision of yourself through this medium. Not everyone, but I think that's one way people think about it. And if you think about that in terms of a design practice is an extremely illogical kind of element, which is that you're so driven by a series of things which you have very little control over. And one of the things that I remember Rem wrote about at the very beginning, which is that, you get these projects which just kind of come to you, and then you're supposed to somehow bring that into your body of work in a way that makes sense, or that is coherent with your own body of work. And that's extremely difficult to do, but it's essential to having any kind of element to what you do at all, having any sense to it. Otherwise, it would just be a series of random acts one way or the other. So you have to try to find in each one of those projects something which makes it your own in a way to approach it, and then to try to mine that so that it directs it in some ways. Sometimes that's utter failure, in which case those projects you try to hide, and then sometimes it works in those projects you try to condense it, and slowly over time to build up this message about what you're trying to do, which hopefully then attracts other people to come join it, and people to help you with it, and things like that. But especially in the early years, it's a really difficult activity. It's this activity of mercilessly editing and reassembling basically your own work to try to tell a story about what you're doing. And so I think that what we've always tried to do is to take this, again, relating back to the conversation before, to try to work into the cracks of capitalism in the sense that we work within the system. We're not, we're not like an entirely pro bono thing or something like that. But within that, to try to build up certain kinds of acts of adding content, or adding complexity, or adding richness to the world through our ability to stick these things into vehicles which are driven by commerce. And so that's basically what we try to do, and sometimes we're successful and oftentimes not. There's in the way back, yeah. Way back here.
Coming from architecture specifically, and branding, in terms of trying to make those things kind of a seamless experience, and at this point it seems like we've added on just endlessly, just putting a flat screen TV somewhere, so a way to sort of add the changing nature of technology and branded. And I'm curious, from your perspective of working in graphics, how do you think architecture can start to maybe more seamlessly coalesce, or predict rather, how to make it a branded experience?
Well, Nicholas and I were talking about this before, because I think that architecture is in this really critical state at the moment, and part of the state is being driven by that whole discussion around the idea of creative direction, right? Which is that increasingly buildings and acts of architecture are seen not as relationship to specific problems, but as part of a bigger ecosystem of whoever's commissioning it and what it means about their organization or their enterprise somehow. And so it used to be that design was a kind of subset of architecture, and there was this flopping that happened where now you have this kind of overarching idea of design, of which architecture is one component, and in that way it's a kind of branded component for an organization. And I think that that's actually a kind of crisis, because it means that architecture becomes operational in a way which it wasn't before. I mean, of course, it always served that function. You could say a cathedral was about supporting the power of the church, but now in this very explicit way, there's a move even away from permanence to temporary, because I think that now things which are seen as more nimble, faster, kind of brand experiences, which maybe don't have the kind of permanence of architecture, are more effective than building whole buildings or something like that. And so I think that there's a real tension right now between sort of what architecture's values are and what it's trying to do, and what the culture is trying to get out of architecture, and what the relationship is going to be.
Yeah, thanks. I'm wondering about that point where you decide whether to stay on brand or to overturn it. As a creative director, do you find overturning is possible, or do you find yourself starting new brands to do what the original ideas maybe?
Well, it's an interesting moment in terms of that, because oftentimes the way that brands change is by changing creative director. And so if we look at the fashion industry, there's right now this incredible fluidity between creative directors and their movement between different brands. And the creative director has their own meaning, and they're kind of inserted into the brand, and oftentimes wipe basically all the work that was done before them out to insert a kind of new vision or new idea. So I think that that's oftentimes the role of the creative director is to have this disruptive effect to kind of recreate the meaning of the thing by writing a new story about it. And you can see lots of different examples of that where, kind of brands die and they come back as a whole new thing, and like, wait a minute, that's about that now? They basically just wholesale change their story and come up with something new. And so again, it's this dissociation, I think, of the thing that's being represented and the form of representation, and that it becomes very fluid, and all different kinds of stories can feel like almost randomly attached to something else, and then suddenly it's that story. And so I think quite often there are these radical changes that happen through art direction in terms of deciding that the brand isn't working, we're going to retool it as a different brand, right? And you can see that in the case of politicians, you can see that in the case of corporations, or of artists, or different things where they kind of just change course at a certain point and decide now we're about something else. So I think that's actually one of the functions of creative direction, actually, to reassess and then reassign meaning to something that didn't have that before. Change direction. Right?
We had one up here. Oh, and one up here. Go ahead, and then we can take last two questions.
Okay, thank you. So you talk about how design shape the way we structure or organize the things we see or perceive, but so does language. So I wonder, and I guess it depends on whether you see language as more fundamental than design, but do you see that across different, do you see design as coming off as different from different language groups?
I would not differentiate between language and design in the way I'm talking about it right now. I would say design is just an elaborate form of writing. So I think that they share exactly the same qualities and the same functions and do the same things. I would say that the difference right now is that in a culture where ideas are often distributed visually, that it has a certain kind of poignancy or power because of that form of distribution. But I think that the categorization effect of design is exactly the same as the categorization effect of language.
Just referencing, I guess, Harari's thesis in *Sapiens*, where he kind of alluded to his man's greatest creation being the fiction that they create, right? And with that in mind, through the lens of creative direction, why do successful collaborations permeate culture? Like breaking down the walls and making bridges rather than borders. For example, like a Basquiat and Warhol collaboration, or a Dr. West and Nikkei collaboration, or a Hermes and Apple Watch collaboration. So,
Well,
I wanted to get your insight on
no, I
what
mean,
works.
I'm optimistic. You know, if I wasn't, I wouldn't feel, you know, that could really go on somehow. But you know, I think that in a way, understanding the system and trying to use the system to change, to extend it, to do something different, I think that's the exact issue we're at right now, which is not to only see it as a series of divisions, and those divisions can be exploited, but that there be another way to do that, which would be about unifications, or about, again, adding complexity, or adding relevance, or adding content to content, or making something more meaningful, or more understandable, or more joyful, or, you know, that all of those things are possible and actually really essential to what we do. That we have, but to do that, we have to really understand the way the system works, and to understand how to counteract maybe the negative effect of the system as well.
So I think the power of recombination and hybridity is a good moment to end on. So I invite you all to give Michael and join me in giving him round thanks.